Dorothee Soelle famously coined the term Christofascism in her book Beyond Mere Obedience. She used the term in 1970 to describe Christian fundamentalists who had turned Christianity into a religion of exclusion and conquest rather than liberation and justice. The term combines Christianity and fascism and has been frequently used in a public setting, but often without going back to Soelle's essay to understand what she meant by the term. Typically, it is generically used to indicate a sort of Christian nationalism, and that's certainly part of her definition, but it is more theologically robust than that. So in this video, I want to briefly look at Soelle's definition of Christofascism and why I think the term is still useful today. But I also want to talk more broadly about fascism and consider how we can deepen the term and more robustly inform the term by looking at a few political theorists and how they define fascism. Soelle's famous chapter focuses on televangelists in America and the emerging Christian right at the time. She criticizes the way the Christian right uses media to advertise the Christian gospel almost as if the gospel were a commodity to be bought and sold. And this effort is often combined with an explicit neoliberal politics, as Soelle points out about Jerry Falwell's book, Listen America. His book combined Milton Friedman's economics with Christian evangelicalism. Soelle comments, "This religious legitimization of capitalism in its most brutal form has never existed in the United States." She is pointing out how Falwell and others used their Christian faith to legitimize capitalism and how this is a core ideology behind the televangelist movement. These evangelistic efforts are not benign or neutral, but involved a clear political ideology linked together with the gospel, which is a dangerous mixture. And so the use of the media to preach the gospel in and of itself is not a bad thing. But the problem here is the ideological justification of capitalism that undermines their efforts. Most importantly, what Soelle identifies is how this pairing of Christian faith with capitalist economics and right-wing politics results in a reversal of the Christian message. What emerges is a vision of the Christian faith wherein solidarity with weaker and marginalized people is no longer seen as a Christian virtue, but rather as an anti-biblical ethic. This reversal is the core of Soelle's critique and vital for understanding the term Christofascism. For Soelle, the use of Christ's name and message to endorse anti-Christ economics and politics is the key issue with Christofascism. And I think this is clear even today when we see examples of people that use Christian messaging in order to reject things such as welfare or anything that supports the poor or the marginalized or the underprivileged. And so this is a relevant term. But Soelle's concluding paragraph in her famous essay articulates this extremely well. It's a longer quote, and so bear with me, but it describes quite well what she means by the term Christofascism. Soelle writes, "In a theological perspective, it is evident that the content of this fascist religion contradicts the message of the Jewish Christian tradition. The God of the prophets did not preach the nation-state, but the community between strangers and natives. The Apostle Paul did not base the justification of sinners on the Protestant work ethic, but on grace, which appears for young and old, for diligent and for lazy people. And Jesus did not make the family the central value of human life, but the solidarity of those deprived of their rights. The most important norms of the moral majority, the Christian right, are not contained in Christian faith, as we can see from many critical remarks against the family that appear in the Gospels. It is characteristic of Christofascism that it cuts off all the roots that Christianity has in the Old Testament, in the Jewish Bible. No word about justice, no mention of the poor whom God comes to aid, very little about guilt and suffering. No hope for the messianic reign. Hope is completely individualized and reduced to personal success. Jesus, cut loose from the Old Testament, becomes a sentimental figure. The empty repetition of his name works like a drug. It changes nothing and nobody. Therefore, since not everybody can be successful, beautiful, male, and rich, there have to be hate objects who can take the disappointment on themselves. Jesus, who suffered hunger and poverty, who practiced solidarity with the oppressed, has nothing to do with this religion. At a mass meeting, 1,000 voices shouted, "I love Jesus," and "I love America." It was impossible to distinguish the two. This kind of religion knows the cross only as a magical symbol of what he has done for us, not as the sign of the poor man who was tortured to death as a political criminal, like thousands today who stand up for his truth in El Salvador. This is a God without justice, a Jesus without a cross, an Easter without a cross. What remains is a metaphysical Easter bunny in front of the beautiful blue light of the television screen, a betrayal of the disappointed, a miracle weapon in service of the mighty. And so what Zola is trying to articulate here is how Christofascism is the inversion of Christ's life and teaching, the idealization of Christ as a symbol of success and wealth, not as the Christ who stood in solidarity with the poor and marginalized. Here, the Christian religion is turned into a message of hatred towards the other, the outsider, a message of exclusion and hierarchy and the defense of so-called family values, to the point where to be a Christian, according to this Christofascist ideology, is to be a capitalist, Republican, gun-loving American who supports patriarchy, hates LGBTQIA plus people, and anyone who is to the left of Ronald Reagan. I would argue that this still describes the Christian right quite well today. The name of Christ is used to endorse anti-Christ policies that harm the poor, the immigrant, and the foreigner, policies which support a capitalist system of greed and exploitation. The God who died on a sinner's cross to appease a violent imperial state has become the God of success and wealth in the American capitalist way of life. That, in short, is Christofascism today. And so this term is highly relevant because the situation it describes is still very much with us. It is still our situation, if it is not even more extreme today than it was during Zola's time. This Christofascist marriage between right-wing ideology, capitalism, and the Christian faith is idolatry and heresy. As such, we must reject it wholeheartedly. The church today must condemn the misuse of Christ's name to bolster up the ruling ideology of capitalism and the exclusion and dehumanization of the foreigner, the outsider, the queer, and the different. And so that's Dorothee Soelle's concept of Christofascism. I want to go further and actually deepen her concept by looking at two definitions that I have benefited from political theory of fascism. I find myself thinking of these two definitions because I think they're very helpful in illuminating our situation in America and to come to terms with that situation. And so these are two definitions. The first is from the political theorist Michael Parenti. The second is from somebody I've talked about before, Aimé Césaire. I never know if I'm saying that name correctly, but the author of Discourses on Colonialism. And so we'll start with Michael Parenti's definition. He calls fascism a false revolution. I think this is an illuminating way to describe how fascism functions practically, because fascism does not arrive and announce itself on the scene as fascism. Rather, fascism comes clothed in deceptive language that's often borrowed from revolutionary unrest or revolutionary movements. And so in that regard, fascism co-opts the unrest of the people, but instead of using that unrest to fight for a better system for everybody, fascism uses that unrest to target minorities in our midst, such as the foreigner, the strange, and the queer. And so fascism in that regard is a false revolution because it co-opts revolutionary language, but it uses that unrest to target not the actual root cause of the problem, which is systemic injustice, but rather to point fingers at certain scapegoats in society and to try to violently expunge them from society. And so the re-election of Donald Trump as president has been heralded as a victory for America, as a return to the American and Christian way of life. But that is a false revolution. It is a revolution of the ruling class for the interests of the ruling class, of the rich for the rich, of insiders against outsiders, of winners against losers. In short, it is a victory of the fascist Christ against the crucified Christ. The rhetoric that Donald Trump uses is compelling, and I think that's a large part of why Donald Trump won against Kamala Harris. He was able to capture quite well the unrest of millions of people within America, while Harris came across quite uninspiringly. And Harris came across as a force for the status quo. While Trump's revolution is indeed a false revolution, Harris's is non-existent. And in an America where millions of people are struggling under the burdens of lack of access to health care, of crippling debt, of poverty, inflation, of rising housing costs, and job insecurity, she offered nothing in terms of real, concrete material help for those people. And that's without mentioning her grievous silencing of the protests against the genocide in Palestine, which was a particularly egregious decision of the Harris campaign. Harris was explicitly and unapologetically on the side of the status quo, and the unrest of millions of people was silenced by her campaign. I think that was her critical mistake. Trump was able to capture the unrest of millions of people, even though he directed that unrest against minorities or those people who are considered outsiders. And so he looks out for the interests of the ruling class, even though he's co-opting revolutionary language to protect those interests. That's simply because Trump himself is a member of the ruling class, and he directs the object of the people's unrest towards minorities instead of against the billionaires, who are the actual root cause, and not the billionaires themselves as people. A good critique of billionaires isn't that they are morally evil people, but rather that the system that allows billionaires to have such power is a problematic system. And so it's a systemic critique is that I'm talking about here. So I didn't make this video to rant about the election. Instead, my point is that there is a bigger issue about an American Christian right that co-opts the name of Jesus to endorse fascist policies of neoliberalism. Parenti's argument is rooted in a Marxist critique of capitalism, which argues that it is a system that is inherently unstable. That instability of capitalism leads to periodic cycles of boom and bust, and those cycles lead to this unrest, this revolutionary unrest that's in the American society today. You can see, for example, the assassination of the healthcare CEO. This is a symptom of that unrest. And so one of the reasons why there's such unrest is because capitalism has a unique crisis at its core, a periodic crisis that comes up every 5 to 10 years. This is the crisis of overproduction. For the first time in history, we live in an economic system where we suffer not from having too little, not from underproduction, but rather we suffer from overproduction, of having produced too much. And the reason why this leads to a crisis in capitalism is that profit requires a scarcity of goods. If everyone can easily buy everything they need, then there is less room for profit for the ruling class. Indeed, one of Marx's brilliant insights is that capitalism is its own gravedigger in this regard. He doesn't mean that deterministically as if it's inevitable, but rather in the sense that capitalism sows the seeds of its own sublation. One way that this happens is because the periodic crises of overproduction, that leads to a surplus in the product, and that leads to various economic crises that then manifest in social unrest such as unemployment, inflation, rent increases, etc. And so the crises of overproduction are quite complex. I'll cite in the description where Marx argues directly about overproduction. I'll also link a video in there. But just to summarize this in brief, overproduction leads to crises in capitalism because by flooding the market with a surplus of goods, that leads to a fall in prices, which leads to a fall in profits. That means that companies go into the red and either fail as companies or they are consolidated by being bought out by other companies. And so overproduction naturally leads to crises because of this complex mechanism of how profit is extracted. But the overall important point is how this cycle leads to unrest within the population. And so that unrest can very easily become a threat to the capitalist system itself, where revolutionary movements try to seize power from the ruling class and assert a democratic control over the way the economy is run. But that is simply because thousands, if not millions, of people are on the street because of these crises, or they're out of a job, and so the unrest of the people threatens the power of the ruling class. And so Michael Parenti builds upon this and argues that it is the policy of the capitalist ruling class to use fascism to defend itself in these periods of crises from the threat of revolution, that is, from socialism or communism. Fascism is an extension, then, of capitalism. And we could also say that fascism is simply capitalism in decay. When capitalism is backed into a corner, it defaults to finding a scapegoat to violently expel from the situation in order to satisfy the unrests of the masses. That is the false revolution of fascism. Those victims are typically a minority, such as the Jewish people were in Nazi Germany, or immigrants and queer people are today. But any minority will do, and so fascism will protect capitalism by channeling the unrest of the people against these minorities rather than against itself as a ruling class. And so here fascism is a false revolution, a revolution of the ruling class against the interests of the people. That is because it is a revolution for the ruling class to regain and reassert its power and wealth during the turmoil of capitalist crises. And so Hitler's rise to power, if you study it historically, follows a similar pattern. In the aftermath of the First World War, Germany faced severe economic crisis. A conservative revolution during that time developed that aimed to regain the glory of Germany. And it sought to find somebody to blame for those problems. And the scapegoat that it found was any leftist, any queer individual, but most of all, any Jewish individual. And so those scapegoats were the central object of the Nazi ideology, and those were who were then used to populate the camps. But the Nazi revolution was a false revolution because it was focused on protecting the interests of property and the ruling class, not the interests of the people. And so Zoelle's definition can be deepened by this insight that fascism is a false revolution that uses its violence to defend capitalism from any sort of revolutionary movement that seeks to assert the rights of the people. Now, there's a second definition I mentioned before that I want to talk about. This is a little bit shorter. It'll take less to explain. This is the definition by Aimé Césaire, who essentially called fascism the boomerang of colonialism. This definition takes a longer historical view on the matter. I've discussed Césaire before on this channel, and I highly, highly recommend reading his book, Discourses on Colonialism. Oh, that's upside down. Discourses on Colonialism. But to put it in brief, Césaire interprets fascism not as an invading ideology into Western liberalism, but as a side effect of Western society. In other words, fascism was not born out of thin air. It was forged in the brutality of colonialism when Europe and America subjugated, otherized, and slaughtered millions around the globe by exploiting their labor and resources in the process. Césaire's basic point is that nobody colonizes innocently. A colonizing nation is already a fascist nation. But because that fascism is directed towards another group of people somewhere far away on a different continent, or towards a people of a different race or religion, then we don't call it fascism in our collective imagination, we call it colonialism. But Hitler and the fascism of the 20th century was the natural progression of fascist colonialism abroad. Fascism merely turns the hierarchical logic of colonialism inward and applies it to the people within the same country. That's by looking for those scapegoats. And so in the case of Germany, it was those various scapegoats that we've named as invading enemies. They're treated as invading enemies, particularly the Jewish people, but also LGBTQIA+ individuals and leftists who were among the first victims of fascism in Europe. Another book that I recommend is a book by Domenico Lacerdo, who is an Italian historian. His book is called Liberalism, A Counter History. It's this one here. It's a bit dense and academic, but he's focused on the history of liberalism and how liberalism was, from the beginning, an ideology of liberty for the privileged few at the expense of the many. And so I think that's relevant to this discussion. But for our purposes here, we should see and recognize that fascism is the application of the colonialist and imperialist logic at work internally in a country, rather externally outside of a country. And so the dominant Western countries have for centuries colonized the so-called Third World by exploiting their resources, their labor, and their lands to enrich themselves wildly, while leaving the people of those countries poor and brutalized by their colonial domination. And so the truth of colonialism is that this is what liberal capitalism actually looks like. Capitalism needs losers to exploit, and it cannot exist without subjugating or exploiting others. Marx talks about this in relation to what he calls the surplus population of the unemployed and homeless. He argued that capitalism cannot exist without the threat of this surplus population to keep the workers subjugated and overworked. People talk about capitalism as if it means Apple and McDonald's, but that is only half of the picture. Capitalism looks like the global South, impoverished and dominated by the global North. The capitalist powers take resources, raw materials, lands, and cheap labor from those countries, leaving them impoverished and dependent. And then what capitalism does is it crushes any revolutionary movement that seeks to democratically control the resources of a country for the benefit of the people who live there. And that much is very easy to prove by looking at the history of South America. What took place time and time again is that the CIA during the Cold War supported and even trained fascist military regimes in order to crush any and every revolutionary movement on the continent, even if it meant the death of millions by death squads. Fascism was used by capitalism to defend its interests in the global South, and it led to the destabilization of an entire continent. When we hear about Haitians today coming to America for a better life, what we often don't hear about is how their country was systematically and intentionally destabilized by the United States in order to protect the interests of capitalism in the region against any revolutionary movement. These immigrants are not coming to America because they want to steal our jobs, but because we destabilized their country and their economy. That is often overlooked in our discussions about immigration, but it is a vital historical insight to acknowledge. You can read more about the history of Latin America from various books, which I'll link below, such as Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. The broader point here is how fascism is connected historically to colonialism and capitalism through the logic of exploitation and scapegoating. Briefly stated, colonialism and imperialism are capitalism that has gone outside of its own borders within one country. In other words, imperialism is monopoly capitalism. And so what Césaire demonstrates historically is how fascism is inherently a capitalist phenomenon. It is a Western liberal capitalist phenomenon. The mechanism of exclusion and scapegoating is a key point of how fascism works in redirecting the unrest of a people towards the outsider or the foreigner within its own country. And so we might press this issue today and consider how the far right in America scapegoats the foreigner, the immigrant, and the LGBTQIA+ individuals within America, all of whom have been harassed and targeted by Trump directly and his allies as the enemies within, the enemies of their particular vision of what America should be. Fascism is when the ethic of colonialism, which relies on the subjugation and exclusion of an entire country or people, is being implied inward against the scapegoats. And so that is what Hitler was about. Césaire states this directly. Hitler is the result of colonialism, the fruit of colonialism. Hitler was colonialism turned inward, and that no one colonizes innocently. And so let me read a quote from Césaire that summarizes these points quite well. People are surprised. They become indignant. They say, "How strange, but never mind, it's Nazism. It will pass." And they wait, and they hope and they hide the truth from themselves that it is barbarism. But the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them. That they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples. That they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole of Western Christian civilization in its reddened water, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. I raise all these points because the popular uses of Soelle's term Christofascism often overlooks the explicit anti-capitalist message at the core of what she intended. And I think these two definitions by Césaire and Parenti on fascism are extremely helpful in filling out Zola's definition of Christofascism. Now, some have criticized Zola's term and misinterpreted her meaning to suggest that she is targeting all the efforts to put Christ first, but that's not her point. Rather, Christofascism is about the misuse of Christ for anti-Christian aims. It is that reversal that Soelle identifies as the key problem. And so I would like to suggest further that the Christ, so-called Christ, in Christofascism is really mammon. It is an idol and a rival deity that has usurped the lordship of Christ. That is Christofascism. It is when money is the primary end of human life and economics, not human flourishing. And so as we begin this new year, I hope we seriously consider these things. I believe we are in a situation where Christofascism is still very much our present reality. But the Christ worshipped by Christofascism is an idol, a false god, and every idol must be smashed in Christ's name, including mammon and capitalism and imperialism and fascism. It is the duty of every Christian today to denounce Christian nationalism and Christofascism in the name of Jesus Christ, who is alone true Lord, the Lord who stood in solidarity with the poor and oppressed. The Christian faith is not identical with American values or the American ethics. In fact, most of the time, the Christian faith is subversive and critical of those values. And so I hope this video has been informative for you, but most of all, I hope it has stirred you up into a sense of action and protest. I do not often talk in this channel about concrete steps. I am an academic at heart, and the crutch of every academic is to be too much in their head. But I do want to recommend two things to you if you want to get more involved on the ground level of resisting Christofascism. First, I would recommend that you get organized. Join a political party and work directly in your community to either protest or to perform mutual aid for your neighbors. There's no perfect political party, of course, and I think that a Christian gets involved in politics in a pragmatic way, never realizing that there is a perfect party that they can identify with or that they can identify the Christian values, truth with, the gospel. But get involved. I think that that's an ideal step because we need to get organized as a people. This idea that a single individual that's going to triumphantly come in and save the day is very much a myth. Change happens by organized effort of a lot of people working together towards a common goal. And so getting organized in any way you can is important. The second step I would recommend along those lines is to work towards unionizing your workplace. Wherever you work, that's a vital step to help collectively get together and learn the processes of what it means to organize and to fight for better change. Because one individual will not come and save us from Christofascism. It will take all of us standing in solidarity with one another, and that is the only hope we have. And so I would encourage those two things. But before I close, I just want to say once again that Christofascism is a heresy that must be rejected, and Christian nationalism is a false kingdom that must be rejected. And so we reject both for Christ's sake. And so I'd also encourage you to take a look at the resources that I link below. There's a number of very good books and videos that I can recommend down there, and I'll try to list as many as I can think of. But for now, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you have a great day.